Welcome back to another video, another Gallows humor video. You're probably wondering why I was jamming out to the Prince of Darkness. This week I'm talking to you about the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 90s. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 90s did not emerge out of nowhere. It was not a sudden break from rational thought. And it wasn't just the result of one scary movie, scary musician, or even a TV show. Geraldo Rivera. It was a culmination of a much older pattern, one that had been developing in Western culture for centuries. To understand how the panic spread so quickly, you have to start with the idea that Western societies were already familiar with a very specific kind of fear. The belief that evil could exist, in secret, operate within society, and remain hidden in plain sight. The idea can be traced back through a multitude of historical moments. One of the clearest examples is blood libel, a medieval accusation that Jewish communities were stealing and murdering Christian children for the use in their ritual practices. There was no evidence of these claims, and they directly violated Jewish religious law, but still, the rumors spread. What mattered was not whether the accusation was true, but what mattered was that it felt believable within their cultural framework. A similar structure appears during the European and early colonial witch hunts, where individuals, mostly women, they were accused of secretly serving the devil. Again, these accusations were not grounded in evidence. They were grounded in fear, social instability. That's a big one. And it shared a belief that evil could operate invisibly through ordinary people. You, me, our neighbors. That's fucking crazy. Anyone could be a witch, kind of. Unless you were the accuser. That's a big story. I'd like to get into that. But that would take me like 6 hours to talk about. If you want to talk about the Salem witch trials, we could. But prepare to buckle up. So even internal Christian groups were not immune to this otherness. The Cathars, their beliefs diverged from the Catholic Church, and they were labeled heretics and ultimately targeted for extermination. That was the word they used. Extermination. Like they were rats or pests. Jesus Christ. Just their existence alone demonstrates that the label of hidden evil did not require complete otherness. It only required slight difference. And over time, these events helped establish that kind of cultural template. So evil was not just a real thing. It was organized, secretive, and embedded within society. That's how we view evil, especially in this country, especially in Christian households. It harmed the innocent, especially children, and it required exposure and elimination. Or if you want to say, extermination. Whoa, full circle moment. So this framework became deeply embedded in Western culture and Western thought, particularly within Christian-influenced groups. Shocker. Christianity itself reinforced this worldview. It presented a universe defined by binary morality. Good versus evil. God versus Satan. Up versus down. Unlike other religions, Christianity, evil was not abstract. It was active, intentional, and it was capable of influencing innocent people. This made the idea of hidden corruption not only plausible, but almost expected. By the time we reached the United States in the late 20th century, the framework had already been inherited, and it's also been normalized. At the same time, the country was facing significant social and economic stress. This is the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis that contributed to the economic insecurity. Divorce rates were through the roof, and traditional family structures were shifting. We were seeing latchkey kids, right? Single moms, double dads. Yeah, I don't know. The family structure was changing, and movements like feminism didn't really help. That scared a lot of people, and still does for some weird reason. But for many Americans, there was a growing sense of fear that something was in their society and couldn't control or understand. And this is the environment in which Michelle Remembers was released. If you're unfamiliar, Michelle Remembers is a book co-written by a psychiatrist, Lawrence Pazder, and his psychiatric patient, Michelle Smith. They also went on to be married after this book came out, So the book claimed to document recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse, describing secret cults operating within regular communities. And although the claims were never substantiated, the narrative was very powerful. Every element of the story aligned with the existing cultural framework. Hidden groups, ritual behavior, moral corruption, and harm to children. Once the idea entered the public consciousness, it did not remain confined to the book. Media figures such as Geraldo Rivera and Oprah Winfrey, they amplified these claims to millions of viewers. Therapists and self-proclaimed occult experts.
There's two different communities that use this park. One is the pagan or occultic community, and the other community is, of course, the homosexual community.
That wasn't a job until the 1980s, but alright. They also reinforced this narrative. What began as a story quickly took an appearance of something legitimate, dude. At that point, belief alone was not enough, though. Some people needed more, and they began looking for evidence, right? If there's a group out there controlling our whole world, there's got to be signs of them somewhere. In that search, some certain cultural targets became highly visible. Among the most prominent was heavy metal music, which is near and dear to my heart. I fucking love metal, dude. I'm getting pissed off just thinking about it. it. But artists like Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest were already controversial. Their imagery was dark, their lyrics referenced themes of death and the occult, and their audiences were primarily young people. Oh no, like the youths. When that began to boil over, it reached political attention. The Parents Music Resource Center pushed for regulation of music. Well, they brought the issue to the national stage, further legitimizing people's actual fears of Satanism and Satanists. So once it was part of the mainstream discourse, the match was already lit. Fuse was going. We're ready to pop off. Social anxiety made people more receptive to the idea. Media amplifying the message also amplified the idea. Courts and legal systems were also acknowledging the possibility of these evils being real, and it became hard not to fall into the trap of repeating history. And that's why when the Satanic Panic came, it came hard. So by the late 80s, right, the question was no longer whether satanic ritual abuse existed. The question was, where is it? You know what I mean? Television specials like Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground by Geraldo Rivera. Fucking, you should watch that shit. It's on YouTube. It's free. You should watch it. It's actually pretty hilarious. He presented a world in which all these hidden networks operated just beneath the surface of everyday life. Programs like Geraldo's, they assembled allegations, speculation, and real life tragedies to become a single narrative, one that felt cohesive, even though the underlying pieces were not. It made the story feel real. Oprah and Geraldo, they didn't prove the existence of a conspiracy, but they made it feel very plausible. And for many viewers, that was enough. Especially if you're thinking, Oprah's talking about this? Dude, she helped me lose fucking 10 pounds last year, and now she's doing this shit. By the time these stories reached television, the cultural groundwork had already been laid. The idea of hidden evil was very familiar. The belief system was in place, Christianity, and all that remained was confirmation. And for that, people did not turn just to television. They turned to cases that involved real children, real investigation, and real trials. Cases that moved through the legal system and carried the weight of authority. Not because they proved anything, but because it made the fear feel undeniable. If judges are hearing about it, and the news is talking about it, Oprah's talking about it, you're reading about it, seems like it might be real. So let's move over to California again. The McMartin preschool trial began in 1983 in Manhattan Beach, California. Tricked you. You thought it was gonna be New York. It's in California. Manhattan. Yeah. I'm feeling it today. So the McMartin preschool trials, they would go on to become the most famous and probably most influential case in the entire Satanic Panic. It started with just a single accusation. One mother, Judy Johnson, claimed that her son had been sexually abused by a teacher at McMartin preschool. The accused was Ray Buckey, the grandson of the school's founder, Peggy McMartin Buckey. So at first the allegations appeared to be serious, but most likely isolated. Johnson's claims escalated very quickly. At its peak, it reached potential 1,200 victims. Judy, at the same time, was making accusations against people in her community, people in her family, basically anyone she knew she was also accusing of abusing her child. And over time, her behavior did raise concerns about her reliability, and she was later understood to have been struggling with very significant mental health issues. And unfortunately, she actually passed before the trials. The case no longer depended on her. So the local police sent out a letter to hundreds of parents whose children attended the preschool, and the letter warned that their child may have been victims of abuse and suggested specific behaviors and acts to ask about. By doing so, the police introduced the framework of fear before the investigation even established one. From that moment on, the case began to expand. Children were interviewed by specialists using methods that would be widely criticized in the very near future. They were asked leading questions, they were interviewed repeatedly, and in some cases they were praised for certain answers and challenged when they did not provide the right answers. So it was basically like these doctors being like, so when you were abused, right, that was bad. If you think you want to get ice cream after, oh, that didn't happen? Well, then we're not getting any fucking ice cream. That's basically how they were interviewed. Over time, their accounts became more detailed, right? More elaborate and more extreme. The more they provided, the more excited everyone got around them. So what began as allegations of abuse have evolved now to something far more complex. So the children described underground tunnels beneath the school. They spoke of multiple perpetrators, mask-wearing people, ritual activity, and being taken to other locations and having experienced events that, upon further review, wouldn't make sense logically. You know, the investigation followed these claims very seriously, though. Authorities did search the property of the school. They also conducted excavations looking for any tunnels beneath the school. They attempted to verify the increasingly elaborate accounts, but they found none. I will note, some structural irregularities were discovered beneath the building, but they did not match the descriptions provided by the children. So there was no physical evidence, no substantiation for the more extreme claims. There was nothing. And yet the cases continued through court. So multiple individuals were charged, but the focus eventually narrowed to Ray Buckey and Peggy McMartin. In the end, it actually produced no convictions. Charges against Peggy were eventually dropped, and Ray Buckey was tried multiple times actually, but juries were never able to reach a verdict, so he was ultimately not convicted, and the case collapsed. This was years after this started. It started in 1983, I believe. And it ended July 27th, 1990. Fucking 7 years later.
7 years.
So yeah, in all, the trials cost roughly $15 million, which, if you count for inflation, that would be like $37 million, I think, today. So it was a pretty big amount of money. And it served no purpose. There was no convictions. There was no evidence. There was nothing. But it still ruined lives. But thankfully, that was just it, I guess, you know? I guess just the lives were ruined, you know? People didn't do extended periods of time in prison. So unlike McMartin, where the system ultimately failed to secure any convictions, the Kern County case demonstrated what could happen when the same patterns, suggestion, pressure, and belief, were allowed to run their course without interruption. So the accusations began in a very familiar way. Children reported abuse, an investigation followed, and interviews were conducted. Over time, the number of accusations grew, and what began as isolated reports developed into a claim of a broader network. The difference was not structure and accusation. However, it was how the system responded to it. Authorities in Kern County moved forward with charges. Prosecutors built cases largely on testimony of children. Physical evidence was limited or completely non-existent, but the consistency of the narrative was treated as sufficient. Unfortunately, juries believed it. Dozens of individuals were charged, many were convicted, and some were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Families were separated, and lives were permanently altered. For those involved, this was not a theory. It was not a television narrative or cultural anxiety. It was real, and they were facing time for it. In the years that followed, the foundations of these cases began to unravel. One by one, convictions were overturned, not because evidence proved that they were innocent, but because the original process had been deeply flawed. So it's not that they were saying they were innocent people. They were just saying, we can't uphold the original trial outcome, so not guilty. But the reversals came slowly, and they came after years had already been lost. So the Kern County cases did not introduce a new type of accusation. What they revealed was something else. They showed what happens when belief is not checked. At McMartin, the system attempted to confirm a narrative, but ultimately failed. And in Kern County, the system accepted that narrative, and they acted on it. So if the early years of the Satanic Panic were defined by investigations and trials, the later years would be defined by nonsense. By the mid to late 1980s, the idea of hidden satanic influence was no longer confined to courtrooms or police reports. It had moved outward into media and everyday life. So the question was no longer whether something was happening, something evil. It was where else it might be hiding. And increasingly, the answers seemed to be fucking everywhere. Like I mentioned before, one of the most visible targets was music, heavy metal music. The music referenced death, the occult, the supernatural. Their performances were theatrical and sometimes unsettling. Ozzy?
Threw an unconscious bat on the stage, and he thought it was a rubber bat, whatever, and he picked it up and bit the head off.
I think we can just leave it at that. But to their audience, this was entertainment. And when I think about this, I think about my dad, total piece of shit. But I grew up on Ozzy, I grew up on Priest, I grew up on this music. And during this time, right, I was a 90s baby. I remember just how present heavy metal music was, not only in my life, but in mainstream. Ozzy Osbourne was on TV, for Christ's sake.
This is how it works. We put power on, it comes on. Simple clicker. The fuck's this shit? This is not allowed. What's happened to it? Where did you get this fucking thing up?
I think the funniest thing, funny story about my dad, he's a raging homophobe, right? He's very afraid of gay men, but he will sing the lyrics to Hellbent for Leather without stuttering. So I do remind him every time that the lead singer is actually gay, and he gets very mad at me. He just claims that he's too metal to be gay, and I'm like, this man has made love to other men, proudly. And you don't believe him. You know what I mean? So to audiences, this seemed like entertainment. They went to these shows for a purpose, to be entertained. And to others, it looked like a fucking ritual, right? So the culture was already primed to believe in a hidden evil. The imagery did not need to appear symbolic in any way. It appeared very literal. I mean, look at some of the album covers of the time. This one. Whoa. Spooky. Yeah? But the references to demons and hell were not understood as artistic themes, but they were more evidence of these artists' beliefs, or worse, participation. So music became more than music, right? It became a potential conduit for evil. So this fear found one of the strangest expressions in the idea of hidden messages embedded within songs. The technique is known as backmasking. This was not new though. What was new was the belief that hidden messages carried intent. So the idea of like hearing hidden messages was one thing. But then when we got into the Satanic Panic, the power of these hidden messages became more recognized. with their ability to influence people and their behaviors. The only problem was that listeners were told what to expect. Gotcha, bitch! They were told what phrases to listen for and what meanings that they should extract from that. Once they were given that suggestion, the experience changed. It was no longer an organic experience. So sounds became words, noise became language, and meaning appeared where none had been deliberately placed. These families argued that hidden messages in the music had influenced a loved one's behavior, even contributing to acts of self-harm. For the Judas Priest case and the Ozzy case, youths unalived themselves while either listening to or like reading or reviewing albums by Ozzy Osbourne or Judas Priest or Twisted Sister. Wasp was another big one. Fuck yeah. These claims were brought to court and they were dismissed ultimately, but I think the fact that they were brought to court and heard by a judge really gave them a lot of weight in reality. To surmise, heavy metal didn't create fear. It just gave fear a face, but it didn't require evidence. You know what I mean? It required expectation, and people expected to hear evil things from evil sources. These ideas did not remain rumors, right? It wasn't just Christians anymore playing music backwards and saying how, oh my God, this is saying this is saying your kids gotta kill themselves or something. You know. So music, television, games, Dungeons and Dragons was a huge one, and everyday media were no longer just forms of entertainment. They were treated as possible vectors, right? Ways in which hidden influence could reach into the homes and minds of the innocent. By the time the panic had reached its peak, late 80s, early 90s, evidence was no longer needed to sustain itself. It was just a part of everyday life. For centuries, Western societies had returned to the same idea in moments of uncertainty, that evil is not only real, that it operated in secret through groups within communities and often against the most vulnerable. The idea appeared in different forms over time: blood libel, where communities were blamed for imagined rituals; in the European witch hunts, ordinary people were recast as agents of the devil; and in cases like the McMartin preschool trial. When Michelle Remembers introduced a modern version of fear, it did not need to convince people of something entirely new. It only needed to remind them of something they already understood. Media's amplified it, institutions acted on it, and culture reflected it. And for a time, the fear felt undeniable, but the cases collapsed, the evidence failed to materialize, convictions were overturned. The stories and narratives they used to push fear, when they were examined closer, they couldn't handle any scrutiny. In the end, the Satanic Panic didn't reveal any hidden evil. All it really did was remind us how easily we can be convinced that there is one. Well, that's it from me, guys. I want to hear your thoughts on this case. There are so many things we could discuss, but I thought I would give you guys a very brief, high-level overview of the Satanic Panic. We'll start delving into the idea there. You know, we can start with the history of Satanism, which only started in the 60s. We can talk about all of that. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Let me know in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to this motherfucking channel, and I'll see you guys soon.
They are hardcore, undercover Satanists. And friend, if you think they're kidding, you're wrong. Dr. Al Carlisle tells us that annually he believes at least 50,000 human beings are sacrificed in this world called Satanism. 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 Satanism.